What does purpose mean for you?
It was linear, it was easy,
Yeah.
it was bound. And if you follow the same steps, you'll get there. And it's an absolute lie.
Has there ever been a period in your career where you were tempted to second guess yourself?
Everything is about profit. Everything is about making a quick buck.
The single most important life lesson you've ever learned. Welcome back to Mork Unfiltered, folks. Today's guest is Sergio Massano, a Portuguese entrepreneur and investor who's anything but traditional. He started his career as an engineer, built a name for himself in venture capital, and then made a bold pivot to start Altas, a long-term investment platform focused on acquiring value-driven businesses, including the ethical menswear brand Isto, where he's now a managing partner. But what makes Sergio stand out isn't just his business moves, it's the why behind them. And in this episode, we're going to dive into what happens when you reach success, but maybe you realize it doesn't really feel like success and you kind of want to do that over. Or, other questions like, how do you make a pivot in your career? Not necessarily when you're 25 or 20, when it's a lot easier, but more likely when you're 40 or 45 and you've built a career and you want something that actually fits your lifestyle, your values, and goals. And lastly, of course, what does this all really mean and how to lead a life of values in a world that's obsessed with a growth at all costs mindset? Sergio's story is raw, honest, and filled with hard-won insight, especially for those of us navigating what I call the messy middle of success, which is the messy part is also the most interesting part. Sergio holds an MBA from INSEAD, a master's in engineering from Instituto Superior Técnico, and postgrad studies in strategy and innovation from ISEG in Lisbon. He's thoughtful, grounded, and deeply intentional about how he lives and works. Sergio, welcome to Mork Unfiltered.
Patrick, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope I'm as interesting as your intro makes me sound like.
More so, even more so. All right. Well, listen, thanks for being on the show. When I look at your career and I look at people's careers in general that I've had on the show, people always have kind of very interesting reasons for why they do things. And one of the things that you realize from, the careers of people who are successful is always that it's never a straight line, right? It's all sorts of zigzags. But I'm also always curious about why people started off the way that they did. So when you look back at the very beginning, have to ask the question, what originally drew you into the world of engineering / business?
I just had to. I think from the age of 3, every single birthday or a Christmas gift I would get, I would play with it for half an hour and then I would try to disassemble it. And I was very, very happy as soon as it had some sort of electronics or electricals inside. My mom still tells you to today that not a single present that I've ever had lasted more than a week, which was fine when it were my presents, but it were my brother's presents. It was the same kind of treatment. So you would disassemble your brother's presents? I don't know if they were very happy about that part, but not very happy about it still today. So it wasn't really a decision that was made by me, it was the decision that was made for me even since the beginning. So I was very attracted to trying to understand how things work, what are the internalities of it. And more than that, how you can assemble things from different stuff. And I remember when I think I was 8 or 9, a neighbor of mine gave me this really cool book in which you could put together really small electrical bits that you'd get from toys or others. And then you could build radios or you could build, thermometers, all that thing. So that created, obviously, every single toy that I had that was still not disassembled would become disassembled within the next few weeks. But just the idea of, taking things apart, seeing how they work inside, and then building something else with it. And also learning that, most of the times they don't really work. So you don't know, especially if you're an 8-year-old. So becoming an engineer was just a natural thing for me. I was always very excited about it. And the path kind of fell upon.
That's interesting, right? Because it's like, you hear so many stories these days of people who are struggling to figure out what to do work-wise, right? And this seems to be an issue that is like cross-generational. It's not necessarily about young people or people recently graduating from college. I come across people every day, including, very smart, fairly successful people with graduate degrees who, literally realize after 20 years of doing something that, they've been climbing like this mountain. And then they realize they get to the top and they're like, shit, I climbed the wrong mountain, right? And so it's interesting to hear your story because from a very early age, disassembling and reassembling things and breaking things apart, even if they don't belong to you, it says a lot about the personality that we have and how important the personality is in terms of if we pay attention to it, how it can potentially shape us and take us in the right career direction if we follow that instinct, right? And so you decided to go into engineering, which it sounds like made a lot of sense based on that earlier propensity and interest to disassemble and reassemble things. Was there other influences with regards to the decision of engineering that came from parents, relatives, or others that you knew?
Yeah, I think you kind of, when you grow up, you're modeling your parents, and you either model them
Hmm.
by trying to be the exact same thing, or you model them at some point to be the opposite of them. And both my
Yeah.
parents had a law background, and my whole family, I was the first engineer. And we're a Portuguese family, so there are like 40 of us for Christmas, and there's 15 of us every weekend for lunch. So my entire family was not of engineers, so they were all law. They were all on the, let's call it, the soft side, or the non-engineering part. And I think on one end, I was always driven to engineering. But it's really interesting that you ask that, because if you were to ask me when I was 15 or 16, I would have told you that I knew that I wanted to be an engineer, but somehow I already had it in the back of my mind that I wanted to do an MBA. And it was even at
Mm.
INSEAD. And this is going to sound quirky, but when I was 15 or 16, it was the 2000. It was like 2000, like 2001. And at that point in time,
Mhm.
INSEAD's new campus was being built, and the dean of INSEAD was Portuguese. And Portugal in 2000 didn't have that many, I guess, role models on the international markets. And I distinctly remember reading an article about it on a newspaper, still printed.
Yeah,
And
Antonio
I thought,
Borges.
Antonio Borges is like an absolute
Yeah,
incredible professor, and such a driving force. And I remember reading about it, and I thought, well, there's something here that the same way that I'm really interested in understanding how machine works, I'm really interested in understanding how the economy works. So
right,
somehow, I think at that point in time, if you were to ask me, I knew that, I'm going to study engineering. I know I'm going to be an engineer for a while, but I want to go in to understand what management is, how to, how to
right,
handle people, how to understand companies from
right.
the inside. So that was always a bit of a driving force behind. I can't really tell you that it was a decision, but I tell you that, there were a lot of steps that I had to take to make that transition, but it was always
Sure.
somehow in there. And, when the opportunity came, you just had to take it.
Now, but you said that you were surrounded by people who had been lawyers, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly.
Was there ever a temptation to follow in your in the footsteps of your parents, and become a lawyer?
Not really.
Okay,
I think
interesting.
my willingness to, or my drive to just disassemble my computer. I mean, one of the things that I loved when I was summer holidays, I would just
Yeah,
disassemble my computer and then try to put it back in. And I would like,
yeah,
at that point in time, you had to go in Cola, and you have an install window that was going into BIOS and DOS. So all these really cool things, but I found
yeah.
exciting. That was what I would do on a random Tuesday in August. So I never had
Okay.
that drive. I did find one thing which was really interesting, which is when you're arguing with someone who's a lawyer or has a law degree, it's really impossible for you to win any argument. They know it.
Exactly.
So that training, I think, it never drove me towards law, but it always gave me an idea of, here's someone that thinks very differently from you in a non-numerical type of fashion, and here's
Yeah.
someone that is able to not only create reason, but sometimes create reason in a way that doesn't allow you to get towards your argument. So I think it reinforced my at least understanding that I was really far from being able to communicate what I want, and that I had to learn into how to interact with people who just think differently.
Yeah. Has there ever been a period in your career where you were tempted to second guess yourself, or was there ever a moment of self doubt where you thought yourself, "Shit, was this really the right thing for me? Should I have done something else?"
Yeah, every day.
See,
Absolutely every single day. I think if you're not, I think you have to be certain to a certain degree, but you always have to be doubting yourself. I think that's
sure.
if you do it in a way that's able to drive you forward, if you don't just get stuck, and you're gonna have days that you're stuck, you're not able to, you're not able to move forward as fast as you want. But I think that level of self doubt, that, making sure that
Mhm.
something is done, that you thought and you rethink, I think that's kind of what drives the edges. I remember there's, John Cleese from Monty Python. He has this
Mhm.
interview, and he's talking about creativity, and he's talking about how his thought process works. And he says
Yeah.
something which I found really, really smart. And he says he didn't find himself to be the sharpest or the best writer across Monty Python. There was someone there who was a lot better than he was, but he found himself recurringly having a better output in the sketches than this person. And he
Mm.
said, so he sat down And he tried to understand why. And what he realized was that this other Monty Python was extremely talented. So he would get, and jokes are just solutions to a problem, which is the setup. He would find that this
Yeah.
person would get very closely to a really good answer, and then he would stop. And John
Right.
Cleese, because he didn't have that ability to create a really good answer at first, he would just create an average one. He would just go
Right.
at it and on again. So the fact that he went with, perspiration at it meant that at the end, he somehow had a slightly better output. But more than that, it created in him the ability to, when facing something that wasn't perfect, this doubting of himself just created this mechanism that allowed him to be just more efficient at writing. So I think that's for me a really good example on how you can doubt yourself and
Hmm.
without wrecking what you're doing at the same
Hmm.
time that you create not only a good outcome at that point in time, but you create mechanisms in your brain that allow you to, just think better or at least to think differently.
Yeah, expand a little bit on that. One of the things I think that a lot of people underestimate, especially when you talk to high achievers or people who have been fairly successful in any domain. One of the things I come across often when I'm coaching founders is, or just business leaders, is the concept of imposter syndrome. Right? It's this realization that you get this job, or you raise the money, or you hire this brilliant engineer, or you launch this product, and everybody's singing your praises, and you're for some reason not believing it. Right? You're kind of like, oh my god, I'm a fraud. People are going to see me for who I am. When you have those moments of self doubt, what are the tools or rituals or habits or people that you lean on to kind of deal with that? Because we all have it, right? It's a question of degrees, and people don't talk about self doubt openly, but everybody has it. So how have you dealt with self doubt when it kind of creeps up? What do you do?
I think people are really important, and
Mm.
it depends from person to person. But when I'm getting into like the self doubt type of modes, what tends to happen is I tend to get lonelier. So
Okay.
if you're used to having answers, the concept of not having an answer, and every time you change careers, every time you change continents, every time you change anything, all of a sudden you're a fish out of your pond. So
Yeah,
in
you're
my
starting
case,
over.
that
Yeah.
means, yeah, and in my case, that means, I tend to become a little bit more isolated, not as a driver, but as a consequence. Okay, let me take a step back. Let me go back to a place where I can find answers before I can reach out to people again. And one of the things that I've learned is it is incredibly inefficient in my case. So
Hmm.
when I have doubts, when I have these moments of questioning, what I've come to realize over time, and it took me a while of not making the right decisions, in this case, just, isolating myself. But I've come to
Yeah.
realize is those who surround you, either people that you work with or friends or coworkers, and really importantly, your family,
Yeah.
they're there to help you.
Yeah.
Things are normally a lot bigger in your head than they are to them. And
Yeah.
sometimes just having the idea of speaking to someone, giving them a little bit of what you're thinking, just their perspective can change
Right.
everything. So there are these
Yeah.
moments, these people, these conversations that somehow unlock. And I think as engineers, sometimes we're very like connected to, let me break down this machine, really understand how it works, and only bring it back to the world when it's already working. And
Hmm.
that is probably the most important thing. Talk to your safe space. Can be a person, can be a sport, it can be a change of setting, traveling, all of these things can work. In my case,
Yeah.
it went from traveling to people to a bit of everything nowadays.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you say that. I think just to kind of summarize a little bit for the audience, I think what I'm hearing you say there is, it seems that on the one hand, when we have self doubt or a fear, it's always bigger in our mind than it is in reality. On the one hand, we have a tendency as human beings to magnify and to blow things out of proportion. So sometimes they're much worse than they really are. And then, what I also heard you say, which is interesting, is, have a safe space of people that you can share this with and maybe get a different perspective, because oftentimes what I've seen is when I share stuff with my coach or with my dad, or with close friends who know me well enough and are willing to be real with me and give me the honest feedback when I need to hear it. But you realize through sharing that stuff that the problem is not as bad as you thought it was. That there are solutions maybe that you didn't see, and that by sharing this, you're able to find a solution more quickly, and also to kind of ease the anxiety down. And then I think oftentimes what I see in my work with others is that particularly people who are more introverted, or have more of that engineering mathematical mindset, they tend to be more kind of like introspective. They have a tougher time sometimes sharing, right? They internalize it, and like you said, they kind of like they see it as a puzzle that they have to solve on their own. And our society kind of like, especially with men, our society has kind of pushed us to believe that you just have to grind through it and you have to push through it and you have to fix it on your own. And that's actually not the smartest way to do it. Like if you can do it, great. But what I found is you can typically get to a solution faster, reduce the anxiety, get more perspective when you actually share the problem and invite others to help.
Yeah, and it's also like sometimes I think about this as, if you're climbing an endless mountain, you're
Yeah.
always looking up, right? When you're climbing,
Yeah.
you're not looking down. And what you were saying, like a founder raises an incredible round, you raise, as a VC, you close an incredible deal. What drives you is, okay, this one is done. What's the next one? So you keep on climbing the mountain
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
never look back, and having people around you, sometimes it's as simple as, well, can you just, take a sip, just sit down right now, look to the mountain that you've climbed, look at all the things that you've done. It doesn't change the perspective of what you got to do, but at least it gives you the time to relax and to enjoy the moment and to gather strength to move on. Right. So, but you're absolutely right. I think when you're very mechanical and when you're very used to, just one after the other, and what
Hmm.
took you there
Hmm.
is that mentality. Sometimes you forget that it's okay to stop. It's okay to take a break. And there's a second thing, which I mean, we're seeing across, I think, teenagers and kids, which is we are overexposed to at least the vision of success. Everything seems
Oh, so true.
perfect. Everything
Yeah.
is, everyone is flawless. You see the not even the light at the end of the tunnel. You see the end of the tunnel. Then someone told you how to get there, and they always make it sound like it was linear, it was easy,
Yeah.
it was bound, and if you follow the same steps, you'll get there. And it's an
Yeah.
absolute lie. You won't. Right? Your
Yeah.
path is someone else's path. They're very different. There's a lot of luck in this thing. You have to be lucky at the time, at the moment, at even the location where you're born. And just being so overexposed to these cases of success, being overexposed to sometimes this drive to, the sky is the limit. You need to stop, be grounded, look back,
Yeah.
and the people around you, whatever mechanism you've got to go for it, it really helps out.
I agree 100%. I mean, I'm reading a book right now by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation. And it's all about the impact of phones and social media on teenagers. And it's appalling, to be honest. It's frightening as a parent when you read the statistics. And it goes back a little bit to what you were saying. It's that, particularly kids who are not yet fully developed, right? And many of our listeners on this podcast are parents. When we let our kids spend an inordinate amount of time on their phones and on social media, part of the risk is that their definition of success becomes warped, right? It's like what you were saying. It's like they see the shiny Instagram picture of the guy with the McLaren, but they have no idea what he did to actually get there and how much he struggled or she struggled and how hard it was, right? They only see the McLaren, or they only see the apartment, or they only see the yacht, or they only see the clothes, right? And so, to me, it's kind of like I always tell entrepreneurs, you have to relish the journey, the good and the bad. Somebody that I had in the podcast recently, we talked about gratitude. And one of the things that, she told me, she's a very religious person. And one of the things that I learned from her, which was very interesting, is, not only do we have to be more grateful for what we are, but we also have to be grateful for the bad things. Because the bad things and the setbacks are really where we learn, right? That's where the growth comes from. And yet a lot of people today, they want it all immediately. They don't want the ups and downs, and they don't want the pain. And unfortunately, life doesn't really work that way. But I wanted to move on because one of the things that was so interesting about the first time we talked that I wanted to share here, because it's such a cool story, is I think you were 26, 27. You had just gotten like this dream job in France, if I remember correctly, and then, and then you go in and you realize what the job's all about. And I think like you quit on the same day or the day
Yeah,
after, and you decided to go backpacking across like Kyrgyzstan and
yeah.
Kazakhstan. So tell us a little bit what happened there. Like what happened? Why was this thing not your dream job? How did you go about making this decision to quit, and why travel? Right? Because it's such an unusual story.
Yeah, it's so I was in Portugal and I had done my master's thesis with Carnegie Mellon and the MIT. And I had been working for 2 years at Portugal Telecom at that point in time, exactly doing that thing, which is a very rare thing. It was like calculating Nash equilibria to markets. And it was, mixed between economics and hardcore engineering. And I had been there for 2 years. At that point in time, I realized Chinese companies like Huawei were coming up. And I had started learning Mandarin, which I absolutely failed at it. And I remember one day looking around and thinking, well, I'm gonna get this kind of lifetime job here. This was, I'm
Right.
gonna get that offer if I do things right. And but if I do that, what happens afterwards? Right? Well, what's going to
Yeah.
be? And at that point in time, I had realized. And the funny thing is, the first time I left Portugal, which is a very tiny country, I was 21. That was the first time I got onto a plane. So I hadn't traveled until my third year of university. I hadn't really gone to places. So I had this urge of, well, if I'm gonna stay now, I'm gonna have this really good job. I'm gonna be settled. It's not a bad thing. But there's this China thing. There's learning Chinese, and I didn't know where I wanted to go. I knew that I somehow thought that the future was in Asia. I had never been to
Mhm.
Asia, so I thought, well, if I can't really afford to fly between Asia, if I don't know where I'm going to land, why don't I just do something different? And I decided to do an overland trip, which started in Finland, went all the way across Russia with the Trans-Siberian, Mongolia, China. And my plan was very funny because and I think that's where being younger is good. I thought, well, I'm just going to go through these places and somehow I'm going to figure out where I want to live and somehow I'm going to find a job. Something is going
Yeah.
to pop up. So the day that I had the offer to stay. So I was talking to my boss, and it was an engineer managing 300 engineers. And he told me, really good job. You're going to stay. We want you to stay for good. And I said, well, I, I have this thing that I want to do. And you could see his engineering mind because he asked me, but do you have a job somewhere else? Are you going to do something else? No, I just, I'm going to backpack. I don't know where I'm going to go. I know I need to figure out things. And I know that I need to learn about new technologies to be a better engineer myself and to understand where the future is coming from. So
Mm.
he was very confused. He told me that 25 years, no one had quit, and he had
Yeah.
300 people under him, which made me even more sure that I wanted to, because that
I'm gonna
that
be the
means that
first.
you,
So screw
yeah.
you.
And if no one quits, that also means that there's a different type of profile there. Um,
Yeah,
and
for sure.
and then it was that, and then 2 weeks later I was flying to Finland, and and then I was in the third class in a sleeping cart in the Trans-Siberian train, which I had to wire money to Russia for a friend to buy it because they didn't sell it to tourists,
Oh
being the
wow.
only foreigner. And yeah, and it was really good. I think it was an incredible experience. Because I had never done it and anything that
Yeah.
looked like that. And
Yeah.
it's this thing of when you're home and we're in your comfort zone, you feel that y what restrains you are your surroundings. So the decisions you make are somehow
Right.
constrained by everything that's around you. When you're traveling, when you don't really have a plan, you don't have necessarily to be somewhere or with someone, then you have to make decisions every day. And I think that that trip was really important for me because I realized that somehow the decisions I was making every day were who I am or who I was
Right.
and who I was becoming. And that kind of, I think, shaped the rest of my career. I've done it 2 or 3 times since there in other places. Kyrgyzstan was one you said. I just after I left my first VC job, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to do VC again. We were talking earlier. How do you figure out your surroundings? How do you figure out what drives you? In my case, at that point in time, was traveling and knowing a world I didn't know yet.
Yeah. And so, you know, touch on that a little bit because, like you said, you've made several career pivots, right? And you made a career pivot because you spent a number of years at Antler, right, as a VC. Did pretty well, were pretty successful at that, and then at some point you decided to walk away from that as well, right? And so how do you do that? Because when you're relatively young, when you're in your 20s, and maybe you're not married, or maybe you don't have kids, or maybe you don't have you don't have a mortgage. It's relatively easier to make a decision like that. But what you find is, as we get older, leaving a career or leaving the safety of a corporate career and the comfort that that has, or starting a new business when your existing business has done well, but taking that kind of risk becomes harder and harder, and people have a tendency to get more set in their ways. So how did you actually make that change, when you had to make the pivot from Antler?
I've done it a few times before, and that's how I was trained at it, right? So I had left a few times around. In my particular case, what I feel that you always have to be ready for, regardless of where you are, is you have to be ready to. True success is when if you're independent and if you're able to at any point in time make the decision that is that's best for you. And when I was at Antler, the same with that, when I was at that job that I told you about, when I was at Rocket Internet a few years earlier, and I decided to go to INSEAD, all of those points I felt that I'm not saying I had reached the summit, but it was really far from it. But I
Yeah.
knew enough about the space and I wanted to learn something else also. So the way I always thought about my career is it's like a stool that has three legs to it. So I'm always want to be really comfortable in two of them. I like the other one to be a little bit wobbly. At the point in time where I feel I'm very comfortable, I want to move around. So the decision to leave Antler had to do with that. I have a higher threshold for risk, I think, than the average person.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate because I had savings that allowed me to, take my time, make the decisions that I wanted in its due time. But more than that, I think, I was sitting. I think I had hit 40. I was just for hitting 40, and I realized the next 10 years have to be not even that. I think the best way of framing it, and this is the thing I do normally to myself regularly is, well, where do I want to be in 10 years? How
Right.
does it look like? Well, if in 10
Right.
years I want to be there, in 5, where do I have to be? In 3, in 2, and 1? And when you feel that your 10-year vision, and if you do this often, then all of a sudden your 10-year vision implies that you have to do something different tomorrow or in
Right.
6 months. So,
Right.
so that was the main driver. Um, I'm fortunate that I have, like, again, like a family, friends that could understand. But my thought process, they typically are supportive, and they would tell you, well, you have to do it. You're gonna be so much
Right.
happier. You got to be so much more of yourself if you do it, not in a blind way, but in a way that you do need to figure it out. But if this is what you want to do, just go ahead. You're able to. So I think that decision of going away from VC was one that was built around, but more than the decision of going away from VC was where I wanted to do. Right, where do I want to go
Right.
next?
Yeah.
And like we were talking, and I think you said in your intro, when you're fortunate enough to have done so many things and have worked with really smart people like I have and learned from all of them, I was thinking, okay, what's missing? What is the net? How can I do something which is as interesting but a little bit? I think it kind of covers another part. And I felt, well, I want to do something of my own. I want to run something that I'm able to do it on myself. But more than that, I want to make sure that, the vision, the way you invest, the way you think, the way you operate is even more aligned with my own values than the companies that I was before. Not because they
Mm-hmm.
didn't have any values or values that I didn't like, just because if you're
Mm-hmm.
building your own, again, like traveling, if you have to make decisions every day, the
Yeah.
decisions you make are your own. And if you have to create a company from scratch, an idea, a model, whatever that is, it
Yeah.
becomes really
Yeah.
your own. So I felt that I was that point in time, and I think, like the first time around, I realized that it's either now or I'm going
Yeah.
to be very comfortable in a VC job for the next 10, 15 years, and
Yeah.
sometimes you need to take the leap.
It's interesting that you say that because so many people in their 40s and 50s, they look successful on paper, right? It's like you look at their resume, you look at what they're done, you have an idea of roughly, what kind of money they're making or how much money they've made. And on the surface, they look successful. But a number of these people that I've met and reconnected with over the years are unhappy, right? They're either unsatisfied or some of them are like downright freaking miserable, right? And so, on the one hand, one of the things that you mentioned I thought was interesting is, that you revisit, quite often your 10-year vision, right? How often should somebody be thinking about this? And do you have kind of like a ritual on how often you revisit your 10-year vision and what do you do?
I typically do it in the week between Christmas and New Year's. That's
Every year?
my yeah,
Okay.
that's like the, over 8 for Christmas. You're not going to do.
Common,
You're
common
traveling.
theme. Yeah.
So that week is kind of over the last 10, 15
Okay.
years where I did it. I don't do any sort of like New Year's resolutions. I'm not going to work out on, January
Yeah.
1st or anything like
Nobody
that.
keeps those. Yeah.
No one keeps those. But I like to, if you think in 10 years or in 5 years or whatever that is, and you kind of roll it back, then every year at Christmas, you think, well, a year ago, I thought that I was going to be doing this. Am I there?
Yeah.
Am I not?
Yeah.
And every time I do it, I don't do it with a grudge like I wanted to achieve and I didn't. It was more,
Mhm.
okay, what has the world brought me? Where am I now? And what do I want to do afterwards? So I always think like that. And then I try to revisit at least the operational part of it, every 3 months, every 6 months, or every time I
Mhm.
need to make a new decision, like a new investment or or,
Right.
looking into which company I want to buy or build or whatever that is. So I think what you shouldn't be doing is, and again, I love John Cleese, so let me use John Cleese again. He has a great, because he worked with Sinner in the 60s on psychology and creativity. And he has a really good example of, you have your open mode when you're being creative, and you have your closed mode when you're
Right.
just executing. And you should be 80-90% of your time in closed mode, but you should allow yourself to have 10-15 minutes, 10-15% of that time on a creative type of mode. So I like to do that around Christmas, and every now and then I like to think, are things going right? Am I happy? And you said something which I found really, really important. It's very easy to fall to the trap of getting really well paid. You're in a cushy job, you're respected,
Yeah.
you're a partner or a managing partner. But if you're not happy, I mean, your body feels it, your mind feels it. And in 70 or 80 years' time,
Yeah, you live it every day.
You won't remember, like, your title will fade, but I want to look back and think I did what I wanted to do at that time. So I try to keep that exercise relevant, recurring, and now I involve more people around it also.
It's interesting you said that. I get the question quite often, why did you leave Google? Because I left Google really at the peak of my career there. We had just launched Google Play. It was a big success. It was very, very well recognized. And people ask me, they're like, why did you leave? And I was like, I left because A, kind of like I was no longer growing. B, it was becoming more and more bureaucratic and I wasn't able to operate the way that I wanted to. C, I wanted to grow and do new things and move beyond marketing. But one of the things that stuck me about what you said, which was also one of the reasons I left, was that I felt that doing that job in that company, the way I was doing it, was no longer aligned with my values. And so you spoke about values as well. And so I wanted to ask you kind of like, how much clarity do you have on your values? Like, for example, are you one of those people, do you know what your like 4 or 5 core values are? Do you have them written down somewhere? Do you make decisions based on that? Or like, can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I had never thought about it like that. So I don't have them written down. I think I have a very strong idea of what I don't want and what I don't feel that
Okay.
is the correct thing to do. I have a very strong idea of what I think is ethical.
Yeah.
And I have a very strong idea of how I feel that, we should separate personal from professional, interact with others, be respectful of others. And that's how I guide myself through it. So one way that I think my written down values are the people around me,
Mm-hmm.
are the friends or the family members that I feel that they are a lot more empathetic than I am, for instance.
Right.
So
Right.
when I want to make a decision that I feel that I'm more an analytic type of person, I don't feel that maybe it's the right, or I feel that I'm not sharing it, do I go to this person? Or people who are more mechanical or more analytical. So I think more and more, a few years ago it was different. I would just kind of put it in my mind. I would just grind over it. I would be physically in pain sometimes even to make these decisions. I think now if you create the African saying, it takes a village to raise a child. I think it takes a village to nowadays to support yourself, because it is, a lot of our decisions are pretty lonely. Your decisions tend to be quite lonely also, right? So you have to create your own version of a village. I think my values are somehow in the village that I've been fortunate enough to create around myself. All decisions I make nowadays, I'm fully certain that what I do, everything else also becomes an opportunity.
Yeah, I know it's interesting. I think I talk about this in my book at one point when I decided to leave Silicon Valley in 2018. It was one of the hardest decisions I ever made. My ex-wife was from Chile. She wanted to leave. She wanted to take the kids with us. I didn't want to leave. And I was working with my coach at the time. And I didn't have absolute clarity on my values. And my coach did something that really helped me and has served me to this day, is she had me do a values exercise. Right? So we went through a series of exercises and I was able to identify my 5 core values, write them down, and then define them. And it's interesting because, to this day on my wall right here, I have like 5 Post-it notes and one for each value. And so whenever I have a major decision that I need to make, I kind of like gut check and I look at my values and I'm like, okay, is this decision in line with all these values or does it go against one of them? And the decision to go to Chile was made because one of my values is, for example, to be the good father. And so the good father, is willing to sacrifice and leave all his friends and leave his network and move to the other end of the world to continue to support his kids. And so even though it was a very difficult decision, and I was 47 at the time, I'd built a career of 10 years in Silicon Valley and I didn't want to move. And I was terrified of moving to the other end of the world and starting over. It was just the right thing to do. Right. So I always tell people, when you have a tough life or business decision that you need to make, the more clarity you have on your values, the easier it is. And for all the listeners hearing this episode today, I'm going to include in the link in the description of this episode, I will include a link to a website you can go to, which is a cool little tool that can help you identify your values and figure out exactly what they are. So it's interesting that you talk about that. I think so many people, no matter how experienced they are, do not have enough clarity, and they find that when they get that clarity, the decisions just become so much easier. Looking back at the career transitions and the decisions that you've made so far, obviously the question would have to begs to be asked is there anything you would have done differently so far?
Again, a lot. Everything in hindsight, everything is 2020.
Yeah.
A lot of things would have been done differently. And I think that if I look back with what I knew at that point in time, and every time I make a decision, I still do it like that. I did it with the most level of information that I felt that I could without not making any sort of decision or being blocked. So I tried to make sure that that point in time, at every point in time, my decisions have enough information so that when I look back, they may be wrong. They may end up, not going the right way, but at least I look back, I'm comfortable with them. But I think putting that aside, and if I could actually go back knowing what I know today, I think what I would have done differently was probably, in some cases, I would have explained a lot better why I was making this transitions. I think in some moments, it may even be abrupt, right? Because in your head, you know what you're thinking. When I left to go to INSEAD, it was very obvious for me. Like I had been thinking about this, but I don't think I gave maybe enough time to the team to understand and give them this context of, it was a lot longer. Sometimes it's really hard for you to manage transitions, and it's really hard for us to manage these decisions. But we forget that the other side is also suffering. The other side also is going to be impacted. So I think communicating those better, explaining where it was coming from, explaining where I wanted to go, explaining how I would be able to help in this transition if it was a professional setting or even a personal one, that would be something that I would have done a lot better. And I don't think I'm anywhere close to being good at it today. But those are the most important ones.
Okay.
Everything else becomes a little bit more mechanical.
Yeah. Switching gears a little bit, one of the things that we discussed briefly in our last call is we talked about, purpose and like more human-centered leadership, your experience in venture capital. One of the things that you mentioned, I think, in our last call is, you said that, companies should be more than engines of profit, right? And that they're often more kind of like a village. And so I wanted to get more clarity on that from you, and especially when you look at what you're trying to build with Altas and the kind of businesses that you're trying to acquire and kind of turn around or change. What does purpose mean for you, and why do you think having maybe organizations that are more values or more purpose driven, why is that becoming so important in an era where it's all about growth and profits at any cost?
I think because exactly of that. I think when you're in an era that everything is about profit, everything is about making a quick buck, and sometimes you even have this feeling of a casino, right? I think that is the exact moment where you have to go. If everything goes right, you go left. And companies, VC backed companies, they tend to be, I'm going to be a rocket ship or I'm going to go to the ground. Now, I've been, with Rocket as an operator, with Antler and say I as an investor. I've seen enough of these companies, and you forget that, when a unicorn doesn't make it, there's hundreds, thousands of employees, people who, worked and gave their guts to that company, that they're going to be out of a job. There's fathers that won't probably be able to pay the bills. So it's really important for me to be able to back companies that are, in essence, really part of an ecosystem. If you have a company that is selling a product in e-commerce, it's not only your company that you're affecting, your suppliers are being affected. the people who are delivering your goods, the customers are being affected. So
Yeah.
for me, it's fundamental that you look into companies that across the whole chain are able to reward those who build for you, like your
Yeah.
suppliers, fair, making sure that you're not creating behaviors which are somehow passing the weight of your decisions to someone else who's a lot weaker or in a weaker position,
Yeah.
that are responsible to employees, that are responsible to their customers, and more than that, companies that are able to, if everything goes really well, grow quite a lot. But if things don't go that well, you're still able to survive. You're still there, and you always hold true to your values. I mean, the saying goes, right? You can only be really impactful if your company is open. But if your company is operating, you need to make sure that every day you create that sort of impact. And profit goes for a couple of people, values and redistribution. And I mean redistribution in this sense, right? Paying the right salaries, making sure that your suppliers are there is very different. And when we look at businesses, and when I look at businesses nowadays, I think there's an area that I'm really very, very interested in, which is demographics. Our entire population in the world, especially developed world and Southern Europe, Portugal are a great example. We have a massive decline of people, and especially a lot of the companies that our parents built in the 60s, 70s, 80s, all of a sudden there's a succession problem with them. They don't have someone who's got to take over the helm. You and I, if you're born in the 60s, you probably had like 2.5, 3 kids on average. One is a doctor, the other is an engineer, the other is a lawyer. They don't want to take over your shoe factory. It's not a shoe factory. It's 100 employees. And you did what's right for them. And now you're in this case of something that you built and there's no one to it. So I think it's really important when you look at businesses also to take that into consideration. Can you actually, quote unquote, save a village or help a village and help 100 people in a specific village to continue something that they've built? And if it's not for you, to connect the right person to do it. For me, that's really important. I'm Portuguese. I'm going to be based out of Portugal. This is where my family is. This is where I want to be. I need to give a little bit back also.
Yeah. I think that's a really healthy way of looking at it. I mean, one of the things that you said in our last conversation that really struck me, and I think it's especially would strike our audience here in the United States is, there are companies in Europe and maybe in the US as well. I think probably in the interior of the country, that's probably very possible, that there are companies where the owners, especially if it's a family business, would almost rather shut down the company and redistribute the assets to employees than sell to like private equity. Can you expand a little bit on that? Because it's so counterintuitive to the capitalistic mindset, where especially in this country, everybody's like, "Oh, make a company and sell it, make millions," right? And then you're talking about these people who are like, they'd rather shut down than sell it to these companies. And so the question is, well, why?
I think it's demographics and geography. So the US, there's a number that I love, which is in the 1850s, I think the population of the US and France was roughly the same, 50, 60 mil. Right now, the population of France is 70 and the population of the US is 330. So Portugal only borders Spain. The borders have been roughly the same since around 500 years ago. And if you were to look into even just 150 years ago, a little bit more than 90% of the people would not leave their village or the area where they were born. I mean, they would travel locally, but they would not go to a major city. So you have to think that in Portugal, in France, in Italy, population has been there for a very long time. People are very connected. So the way they built their business is also connected. It's not like if you were building a company in the south of France or the south of Portugal, you would bring people the same way that if you're building a company in Utah, you'd probably bring someone from New York, from California. You'd be very agnostic. So there's a very strong connection to your employees will be some people that you grew up with or that are friends with your parents or your kids. So when it comes to the point of selling, it's really interesting because you get to this point, which is you feel that you have a fiduciary obligation, not your shareholders, which is in this case, typically yourself, but you have to the ecosystem that allowed you to build it. So a lot of people will tell you very, very seriously that it doesn't matter if the company shuts down. I would rather sell it, redistribute, make sure that those who have helped me in this journey are okay and go in peace with it, than to all of a sudden hand it over to someone who I don't know that doesn't know the team. I've heard incredible stories, really funny stories of, friends who are buying companies and you go through the whole financials, and then the owner will say, well, there's this gentleman who, he's the groundskeeper or something like that. He can never be fired. This person, I've taken care of him. I promised his dad that I would take care of him. He's now in his 60s. He's going to work here until he doesn't want to work anymore. Don't worry about it. He's a very nice guy. But this is kind of as important as whatever earnout you're going to have. So you have to understand culture there.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that. I think it speaks a lot to, the other thing that you mentioned about Altas and the way you're building that, right? It's like, it struck me that, I think if I remember correctly, you used the word stewardship as opposed to ownership. And that's a very different mindset, right? To traditional, particularly private equity, right? Backed companies, where private equity companies oftentimes, rightly or wrongly, get accused of being vultures and just coming in and stripping companies down. Certainly some of that does happen. Unfortunately, it's not always the case. But, why did you choose the word stewardship? What kind of culture are you trying to build at Altas?
I think a culture in which you are, even if you're not the first to come into a company, you are responsible to make sure that it grows in a sustainable fashion, like we were saying. And you're responsible at any point in time to make sure that the right person is at the helm. So in some of these companies, I'll be the right person for maybe a long time. In some others, I won't be. But stewardship is this, for me, it's this idea that you take care of your things. You pass it over to the next generation, if it's in your family, but you pass it to the right people. There's really no point in building a company that all of a sudden you're selling and just someone is breaking it for pieces, unless there is absolutely no other solution, right? And they typically are. So I think it's important to do that also, because if you think like that, you make decisions that drive that. Like if your 10-year plan is that you'll hand it over to the right people, that this company is meant to last, you'll be able to hire people who think like that. You'll be able to feel that it's not the time for you, and you'll be able to hand it over, and you'll be able to have, I think, a redistributing type of, and I'm saying redistributing quite a lot, but you won't have employees. You'll be able to making sure that the CEO of the company you're handing over has a lot more equity than they would normally have, that it's also part of their journey. So for me, that's super important, especially again, like you were saying, in a world where everything is very binary and it's, success or nothing. Quiet success and quietly building and having an impact. I think for me, that's the most important thing.
Okay. Well, that's really profound. And I think certainly there are a lot of people out there that are questioning the capitalist model, right? Where we're seeing, especially in this country and certain parts of Latin America, you're seeing, a rising Gini coefficient, right? The inequality between rich and poor is widening. The middle class, especially in this country, is getting completely squeezed. The current administration's tariffs are obviously not helping that. It doesn't seem like they paid attention in their economics classes.
And history also.
And history. Well, yeah, I don't think, maybe they didn't go to class at all, and maybe they didn't graduate. Certainly, it's a gentler, more compassionate form of capitalism, which a lot of people here in this country would immediately jump to the word socialism. I would disagree with that. I think it's kind of like, how do you find a balance between some of the socialist excesses in Europe, which sometimes are excessive, and the capitalist excesses in the U.S., right? But as we wind down the podcast, I wanted to finish with a couple of questions more that are reflections for you. One of the questions I love to ask people, because everybody has slightly different definitions, although I find that a lot of people who show up on this podcast share a similar definition. You've had a fair amount of success by conventional standards, right? Definitely when I look at your resume and your time in venture and the deals that you've done and everything else, and starting Altas and building companies. But more than conventional success, I'm curious to know, what's your definition of success? How would you define success? What does that mean for you?
Yeah, I think for me, success is making sure that I wake up every day, that I'm looking forward to what I'm going to be doing, and that at the end of the day, what I've done has been good for me, but it also been positive to others, and that I'm able to use that both in my professional but also my personal life, and that my priorities are aligned straight.
That's super helpful. And you mentioned something else which struck me that I wanted you to unpack a little bit more. And I don't know how tied this is to your definition of success, but you said that You can only be indispensable if you're fully replaceable.
Yes.
You remember that?
Yeah, absolutely.
What did you mean by that? Because it made me laugh when I remembered about that, because I went through something similar at Google where I was walking around my team in a meeting one day and I realized that everything was working fine. It was working great and we were crushing it, and that I really didn't need to be there. And on the one hand, it was very rewarding because I felt like I was doing a good job. But on the other hand, I was like, holy shit, does that mean like they don't need me? Can they fire my ass tomorrow? Like, what, should I start looking for a job? But tell me, what did you mean by that? What do you mean by, being fully replaceable? Right? You can only be indispensable if you're fully replaceable. What does that mean to you?
It means a lot of things, and it was told to me by someone just before I left for that trip we just discussed. And I always found it really incredibly thoughtful. And what I mean by this, I think there's so many layers to it. I think the most obvious one, at least when you use it in a professional setting, is opportunities do come, and they come quite often. You're typically not able to grab them as you want. So
Right.
if you are in a position in a company, whatever that is, that for that thing to work, you're absolutely irreplaceable. You're 40, 60, 80 hours a week. Those opportunities will go past you and you won't be able to hold on to them, right? So from a
Yeah.
professional point of view, you always have to be able to grab those opportunities. And there's corollaries to it. So if you are absolutely replaceable, that means that you've hired a team that you've delivered. But also, if that team is stepping up, then they need to have hired a team that can take their jobs, because this is an entire chain that cannot break. So
Right.
from a pure on, like, I think, work point of view, this is the way I think about it. Is this is how you can maximize opportunities, and really interestingly, this is how you create teams which are engaged, thoughtful, and
Yeah.
they feel that there is an upwards path. I think from a personal point of view, it also means that you're able to trust those around you, and you're able
Right.
to pass on what you feel that is really important, and then just let people, make their own decisions. So for me, it's that binary going into a company, understanding I have to be here, but if I'm not, they have to be fine. They have to
Right.
stewardship that we spoke about, right? They have to be able
Yeah.
to continue, and you can only do that if you pass as much knowledge, if you learn as much from the other side, because you cannot really teach anyone, they will learn. So you have to understand how you pass that. And that's,
It,
yeah, I found it really beautiful.
it's a fascinating point of view because I think there are many executives that subconsciously don't believe that in a bad way. I remember working with a bank in South America where the CHRO wanted me to coach the CEO of the bank. I met him, very, very smart guy, very talented, very good at what he did. And he never moved forward with the decision to coach and to work with me. And I didn't, sometimes people are not ready for coaching or they don't want coaching or what for whatever reason. But the feedback that I subsequently got, and that I got from the HR team was that part of the work that we were going to do together was to help him strengthen his executive team so that they depended less on him. And ultimately, what we realized is the reason he didn't want to go there was that he wanted to feel irreplaceable. He wanted to continue to make the decisions. He wanted to continue to be the center of attention and feel needed, which I could understand from a human point of view, right? It's the Maslow's pyramid, Maslow's pyramid, right? Is it we want to be significant, we want to feel needed, but he was actually doing harm to the organization by doing that because he wasn't really putting them in a position where they could succeed without him, which was ultimately going to limit his growth and their growth, right? So it turned out to be very selfish. And it's weird because people don't see that, right?
I mean, there's
Most
a
times
saying,
they don't see it.
which is very true, right? The cemeteries are full of irreplaceable people,
Yep,
right? And the day we're gone, we're gone. It's fine. So
exactly.
we're not really replaceable. We're part of a cog. We're going to do things our way,
Yeah.
but you got to make sure that whatever comes next and whomever comes next has some fighting chance.
Yeah. For last question before we go on to the lightning round, and I have to ask it because obviously you spent so much time in venture, and there are entrepreneurs that listen to this podcast. And a lot of what we talk about is entrepreneurship. You've spent a lot of time meeting founders. You've obviously denied most of them funding because that's just the law of numbers in venture, right? Which is always hard. But when you look at, the people that you have invested in, are there one or two traits that consistently you look for across founders that you say, this is the kind of founder that I want to invest in for this reason? And does it tie
Yes.
back maybe to this idea of being irreplaceable?
It's actually there's two traits. One is obsession.
Okay.
An obsession is not 100-hour working weeks, is just knowing where you're gonna go. There's this thing about founders being coachable. I like founders who are not coachable. You'll tell them, well, you should go right and left, and they'll tell you a really cool story. This is what I want to do. This is the direction. And the second one is they build incredible teams. It's very hard for any founder to be successful if they don't build an incredible team. And
Yeah.
it's really, really hard. It takes a special type of person to be able to drive and bring incredible people when you're selling nothing more than a dream, right? Because that's what startups are. You're bringing the executives that are going to lead your company when they're 5, 10x. They're taking a leap of faith. So founders who are obsessed, they know where they're going, and they can sell and bring people towards that vision, they tend to win. Great companies with bad teams are not great companies. Companies or businesses which are not great and find great founders and great teams within, they'll figure out a way.
Right. So obsession and the ability to build and retain great teams.
Which is communicating that obsession, right? And it's bringing other people on board entrepreneurship is a boat. It's a sailing boat. Everyone needs to be coordinated. If you want to have the best sailors, you need to bring them onto your boat first.
I hear you. Fantastic. That's been an amazing conversation. So moving to our lightning round, I always ask 3 quick questions to everybody that I interview. They're always the same questions. So they just require very quick answers. So question number 1, if you could have one superpower, what would it be?
I think infinite knowledge. It would be a burden.
Infinite knowledge.
That would be it.
Okay. Well, you're getting pretty close with ChatGPT and all the LLMs out there, but yeah. Okay. Infinite knowledge. Question number 2, if you could have dinner with anyone in history, alive or dead, who would you choose?
I think I would pick Henry the Navigator. He was the Portuguese prince in the 1300s who started the discoveries. And at a point in time where finding anything and looking outside your borders was out of anyone's idea, he not only did that, but he did that scientifically. And I find that an incredible feat.
Okay. And last but not least, the single most important life lesson you've ever learned.
You're gonna fall. It's getting up. And it's trying one and again. It's never linear, and everything is easy in hindsight. Just make sure that you forget that when you made those decisions. Make sure you don't forget that when you made those decisions, you weren't sure of what the outcome was. So, stay humble, stay focused, and keep moving.
Sounds good. Stay humble, stay focused, and keep moving. That's great. Well, listen, Sergio, it's been an amazing conversation, very open, very vulnerable, very insightful. I really appreciate it. I think, you remind us that, success is not about climbing the ladder the fastest. It's about making sure that we're leaning that ladder against the right wall or the right mountain more than anything. And I think also, in a world where people increasingly are worshiping speed, scale, superficial wins, I think your journey has helped me. And I think, people listening to this podcast maybe ask some deeper questions. I think, what's the legacy that we want to leave? Are we building a career, that serves me or my life, or is serving others? And also, what does it mean to kind of like lead and manage your life with intention? Especially when no one's watching and you're not getting the credit. I think there's so many things I think people can take away from this podcast that I think are really helpful. And whether you're mid pivot or you're mid burnout or you're thinking about what's next in your career, I really hope that this conversation has given everybody listening today some clarity, some courage, and maybe a little bit of company on the road ahead, whether that road is on Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan or wherever it may lead you. So, Sergio, thanks again for your honesty, for your humility, and for showing us that the most meaningful paths out there are not always the ones that that fit the map. So I really appreciate our conversation today. For all of you out there listening, if this conversation has sparked some interesting thoughts or ideas, leave some comments in the show. Wherever you happen to listen to this podcast, make sure that you subscribe to this podcast so you can get every episode that are as powerful as this one. Hopefully, this one's leaving us a tall bar. And obviously, if the content was resonated with you, make sure that you share it with people that can really benefit, because there's a lot of people who are struggling right now. A lot of people, whether they're younger or older, who are trying to figure out where to go next and are confused and lost. or maybe just a bit scared. And, I think Sergio's approach to managing fear and kind of helping us realize that stepping out of our comfort zones is not impossible, but it's necessary. I think that's something that all of us can take away from today's podcast. So, Sergio, thanks so much, man. This has been really helpful and really insightful, and I appreciate you coming on the show today.
Absolute pleasure, Patrick. Thank you so much for having me. It's very easy talking to you, so if it was insightful, I think it's a lot.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. And we will see you on the next podcast of Mork Unfiltered. Cheers, and see you next time.